this is just a very rough voice note. I just wanted to make the point that this is almost an addendum to my efforts of trying to advise and make useful suggestions to the DA and useful sort of analysis of their position. And I understand that I'm generally criticizing the DA from the other side of the aisle, as it were, in terms of how they are usually criticized by the media and by their ideological adversaries. And so, like, I'm, and I do think that the DA does have an image problem. It has an image problem for multiple reasons, because of its proximate history with Mmusi Maimane and essentially how the party used to overtly endorse a kind of identity politics. And it's, the DA has kind of changed its tune, and it has revived the intellectual sort of merit of the party, but it doesn't convincingly sell itself in doing that. And the media is large, and well, essentially, if the media is going to make that claim, then it has to be properly and convincingly rebuffed. It has to be properly and convincingly refuted. And if they continue to make that claim, then you have to go after the media somehow. Otherwise, you lose the ostensible image of authenticity, because essentially you lack the conviction to prove the veracity of your claims and of your general line and your general position. So my solution is look, the DA is doing things that what's the word, that contributes to this. So the DA is partially at fault for this in terms of, because it hasn't proven its own authenticity on this. Just because you have a new leader that is taking a new line is not enough. The brand of the DA has been besmirched, and it hasn't been properly cleansed, and it's not going to be properly cleansed until you do something like the following, and I'm going to say more than one thing now. Because basically the problem with the change of direction that the DA has taken is just that they had a new conference and they have a new policy document, essentially. They have a new federal constitution. That's not enough. You have to have something like, and this is what the DA has had internally. The DA has had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission about this inside of itself, but it has done so privately. It has not done so publicly. Helen Zille needs to apologize, essentially. And I know, look, I don't take any, look, I think Helen Zille is such an important ingredient of the DA because she changed her line. She reversed her position 180 degrees. But because that has essentially been done tacitly and not patently and in the press and on the outside, it gives credence to the kind of disingenuous treatment that the DA gets, because it's like, this was not done, this was not ventilated. And again, like, also, I would say what the problem is that you don't have anyone getting into the weeds of promoting the anti-identity politics line. You need someone to really go down and laboriously lay it out and get into details on multiple facets of different things, just so that there is an intellectual, substantive elaboration of the principles. And if that isn't done, it really just looks like smoke and mirrors. It really just looks like, well, this is the new face of the DA, but there's no conviction behind it, and therefore you really don't, the DA really needs to apologize for what it did essentially to many Cape-coloured voters in the Western Province who felt alienated because they weren't black enough to receive any kind of developmental rhetoric from Mmusi Maimane. That needs to be fixed, because essentially that shock to non-racialist politics, we haven't had a proper reckoning with it, and the thing that really needs to be counted is in 2019, Mmusi Maimane had an interview with Eusebius McKaiser just before the national elections, and all the substance that went over in that exchange the DA needs to be able to respond to each of those questions that Eusebius Mackiser makes. It doesn't mean that it's a good question, that it's a decent question, that it's a proper question. Sometimes the answer to the question is your question proceeds from immoral principles, and I impugn your character for actually thinking that that's a legitimate question in a society that's supposed to have some kind of democratic literacy. Like this is not, this falls outside of the definition of robust debate. This is anti-constitutional propaganda. This is unprincipled. This is also unreasoned and unreasonable. It treats people like chattel of their group identity and stuff like that. That you can just treat people as a fungible representation of their racial category, and that there's some kind of collective historical guilt that we can just racially divvy out, and that's going to be the solution. So that look, I'm not a perfect communicator. I'm not saying that like that I would do the job. This is not something that I could probably do, because you need to be able to simplify things. But you also need to be able to to get into the weeds of this kind of stuff. And I think that it should ideally not come from the leader. The leader is making the right signals and is towing the more populist line, but you need a lieutenant, you need many lieutenants that have this kind of ability and this goes into so having a much more nuanced view over into the gender-based violence craze, because like that whole formula of pontificating and creating these huge ideological lines essentially is the same feminist version of identity politics that they are trying to do to race. Like just kind of the idea that we just need to have more systemic complaints against toxic masculinity, and that will solve the problem of gender-based violence. And it is a much more complicated issue than it seems. And the idea that, oh no, we need to change the stereotypes around masculinity or something like that. The whole thing. So that kind of ideological incoherence and inconsistency, I think, does lend credence to how the media is dishonest in its treatment of the DA. But there is something to the target. There is something that can be improved about how it's targeting the DA, that the DA could do. And the DA is not covering these I'll just say weaknesses, or let's say vulnerabilities in its platform, in its brand. And some of this damage is, in some sense, historically speaking, it's self-caused damage, and we need to work out, or the DA needs to work out how to address that. And I understand that. Look, I'm attacking the DA from the other side. I'm not, but essentially this is the legwork that has to be done in order to be able to be convincing to people. Because I do think that the DA, if it takes this harder line, in the same way that the Freedom Front Plus is able to attract black voters because it's able to get down to business, the DA would have a much greater magnetism to being able to attract former ANC voters. The DA needs to attract former ANC voters, but it's only possible if you actually show a properly coherent ideological face. That after you debunk and you diagnose what the ANC is doing, then but part of that is the moral debate, which the DA is not properly contending. You have to morally impugn your ideological adversary. It's not enough just to say we think that we're right and they're wrong. You actually have to say no, that there's something very bad about what they're doing. It's also unconstitutional. We have the ammunition of the Constitution. If it can, it's hard to bring that aspect into it. I've got recordings talking about it, and I understand how problematic it might be to talk about some of these things. But I'm sure there are ways of phrasing it into describing what the Constitutional Court has done to create this toxic political football of racialist politics and racialist policy, which then has essentially normalized racial consciousness and all the problems that we see, essentially. But so yeah, I do think that these things have to have to be worked on and surmounted. And I know that's quite a. There's a lot of work on this, and I mean, in some sense, the weakness that the DA, the main proximate source of some of the weakness is that the DA had a secret Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and therefore it did not properly give rebirth to its brand in the public sphere. And it needs to make up for this. I'm not saying that it has to have a Truth and Reconciliation out in the open. It's hard to do that if it's going to be staged, because you already did it in secret and now you're going to do it for the public. But you need to have an explanation as to the story of the party and the history of the party, and it needs to apologize for its history. If it cannot take, like John Steenhuisen has certainly taken responsibility for this, and I don't think that he should be the one making this mealy-mouthed kind of this horrible point. Somebody else has to make this horrible point that has a DA office, that has a DA. They have to get into these kinds of details, and they have to kind of be talking to the press and essentially being much more volatile. So much so that maybe then John Steenhuisen can apologize for oh yeah, that exchange didn't go so well, but this is the point, and you can understand the frustration on our side. You know, that almost you need to have a bit of a loose cannon that is capable of doing something like a bully pulpit in order to really try to make inroads on the DA line, and that will prove the conviction and the authenticity of the line of the DA. Like, obviously you don't want perhaps the complete leader of the party missing the mark, but you need someone in the party that's capable of missing the mark, so that people can actually they can plot exactly where the DA is. So that, because the DA is already being vilified. So if you're going to be vilified, you might as well be vilified for the right reasons, rather than the ideologically dishonest framing of the reason. At least then, if you could be vilified for the right reasons, then you're capable of making ground in terms of convincing people to change their vote, because you can actually say, essentially, that the media is in on this corruption, is in on this moral corruption, that the moral corruption is the thing that is disguising the state corruption, that the state corruption is the symptom of the moral corruption, and we can look at essentially the moral corruption of the media in essentially its normalization of racial populism and racial populist politics, and how that is essentially how this means that we're never going to have democratic literacy, because essentially the whole lens that they're looking at it is so rotten, essentially. And if we can't red pill, the DA is already essentially, it has to red pill people on these kinds of things. There's no way getting around it, and it's failing to take up that mantle. I think it's failing to do that function. And so, you've got a party line, and you've got an ideological position, which the whole zeitgeist and the media, or it's hard to say zeitgeist, because regular people, you could say, maybe agree with you, but they can't square the stark difference in the treatment of the DA's position by the media. And so you have to go out on the offensive. You have to create an explanation for this. Well, this is why. Let me please explain to you, electorate, this is why journalists, essentially, even when they seemingly are conducting fair interviews with us and fair media coverage of us, why they've got it so backwards, because essentially they've got moral presuppositions which are anti-constitutional, in fact, and our whole system is essentially is being poisoned with this kind of democratic illiteracy. Now, look. I mean, I'm just trying to outline it. Obviously, the things that I'm saying are not the things that should actually be communicated, but this is the subtext of what should be communicated. Obviously, how to actually lay this out. But again, this is somewhat messy work, and it would be better if people in the party, if someone in the party was there to even overshoot it, so that other people could recontextualize the overshoot, and then essentially the position of the DA starts looking much more principled. Because even if you're going to be vilified anyway, so at least if you're being vilified, then they're talking about you, and then you, at least even the people vilifying you, will say, well, the DA has actually responded to this charge and this accusation that this is their answer. So at least when they continue to repeat their accusation and they continue to repeat the answer of the DA, the final answer of the DA is a very simple and principled point. And then you got them magnifying the choice. You've got that it's either the common sense short answer that the DA makes, or it's the convoluted ideological accusation that's premised on racialism and racial populism and essentially a kind of dishonest framing of many, many issues. And so, when you give, you have the forays, and then you're left with them repeating their ideological charge of their propaganda, and then, but the DA just says this about it. And then you've got the DA, and then you've got this juxtaposition always being fed to the public that it's their ideological contrivance versus a principled common sense thing. And engineering that is how the DA promotes its message, and it needs to start doing this formula as soon as possible. There is no room. There's only 2 years until the national election, and this is how the DA sets up its brand. And then, Action SA has got its brand, and it can capture the people that are sitting on the fence on identity politics or like identity politics but don't want to vote for the ANC. Then they can vote for Action SA, or if they're full-blown fascists, they can vote for the EFF. Okay, so. But the DA needs to make its ideological quadrants and brands. It needs to make it distinctive, and its character needs to shine through. And it's being bogged down by trying to pander to too many different people that are perhaps on the fence, or that they're too embarrassed about the kind of media coverage that they get. You need people that are willing to wade into it because they have a kind of the principled formula undergirding the issues well enough that even if they get pegged as the ideological, if they get labeled as being they know that the party is going to back them up with, even if they dishonor what was said, but they agree with the principle of how it was said and what it means in context. Because if you're worried about getting tripped up with the language and I understand why the leader always must be precise in his language, but the leader can also, in the same way that John Steenhuisen defended the Phoenix posters, that is the formula for success, and that must be replicated, and it must be duplicated on scale, en masse. If it is not, the DA is going to lose the DA doesn't have a strong brand, and it doesn't have a distinctive brand. It's because I'm criticizing it from the other side, and if I can criticize it from the other side, then the people who are dishonestly framing the DA are sure as hell going to say that the DA is just not authentic about its own position. And as I've said, that's just, you need to prove the conviction, the authenticity. You need to start creating evidence about it and be proud to prosecute your values and your principles, not just defend them when you are being hounded, as it were. And when you attack people, don't attack them because you don't like their politics. Attack them because of constitutional reasons, because how it affects the health of the Constitution. And then in some sense you have to say something about how the constitutional order has been disordered by these essentially political constitutional court decisions to make a toxic political football out of racial politics. And so, you have to remind people about what the content of the Constitution really is, and how this shouldn't be a political issue, but it's been made a political issue by the court. Now, look, there's a way of saying that without saying that the Constitutional Court is overtly wrong, but just say that you you disagree that that's how the Constitution actually should function and should. So, without actually impugning the integrity of the court, you can say that essentially that their decision is essentially tolerating something that is inconsistent with the Constitution, and they are saying that politicians and the democracy has to, if it doesn't like it, has to choose something else. But this is not essentially how a supreme constitution should be. That in your view, that is not how a supreme constitution should interact with a democracy. That the Constitution must be supreme and above the democracy. And because it isn't, it has created this normalization, which then journalists have felt okay to push the racialist button. So it is essentially, it has promoted racialist demagoguery and racialist political rhetoric in the country, which is obviously gave huge disguise to the ANC to continue its corruption. And to disguise it in a kind of racial populism, and the EFF also to carry on this kind of racial nationalism, or actually, I guess it's the opposite in some sense. Maybe the ANC is more racial nationalist, and because because the EFF is pan-African in its racial ethnocentrism essentially, but so you really have to look at the ANC and the EFF are not there. They're not there in and of themselves to win. They're there to destroy their adversaries. Between the ANC and the EFF, they are designed essentially to stop a real ideological alternative from emerging. They together are the obstacle for actually having a proper synthesis that makes sense in the mind, that you can actually spread and promote and advocate for properly. And the DA is falling into the trap essentially of of not being able to treat the media properly in order to diffuse in some sense the ANC and the EFF politics together have created a quagmire that the media is just completely transfixed by, and allows the media to use the kind of the morality of identity politics to essentially make the DA forever unpopular. And if the DA does not start contending with that as its major ideological adversary, it is not going to be able to convince anyone through the noise, because you have to fix the intellectual elites, the thought leaders, or the commentary class in society. If we don't start segregating the media and saying, no, we don't talk to you because you're from that institution, and that institution is filled of anti-constitutional political hacks, and you've got toxic racial consciousness ideologues, we don't deal, okay, that's one way of doing it. Anyway, what is my point? Sorry, I'm not making the right point, but I'm illustrating the point instead. I still haven't found a way to properly articulate this precisely in terms of what the strategy is, but I think I have outlined it, and the necessity for it. Sorry, there was another point floating around here. Let me think if I can try to find it again. And you can see this with everything. You can see this in how Eskom doesn't properly plan its power generation, and then it gets out of, in some sense you can see how just weak and irresponsible the system is, that it is trying to discredit the concept of judiciaries and the concept of judges and the concept of the law and the rule of law. Because essentially the Eskom is so bad in its planning, and it falls apart, that a third of its generation is going to be closed down because of a court order, because it's too pollutant, because it's got too much sulfur dioxide in the smoke, or something like that. And so, the more that this happens, the more that society gets gaslighted, because essentially Eskom's plan is that we are committed to these international targets of having less pollution in our air, because we expect by 2030 to decommission a lot of our coal, because we're trying to meet these target things, and we don't have the budget to do that at all, but we expect other foreign countries to give us money to help us do it. So our plan is that we have not secured funding for this plan, but this is our plan. It's completely irresponsible. So you can just because of the hysteria of the climate crisis, because you have a systemic oppression that we can be hysterical about, some kind of collective guilt, then we can be as irresponsible as we want, and then we can just scapegoat the blame when the time comes, and essentially, let's not actually have judges scolding us for our bad planning. Instead, there's something wrong with a judiciary itself. There's something wrong with the rule of law. We just need to be adopted by someone who will actually give us sympathy because we're doing the right thing by making these irresponsible plans. It's the opposite of governance. It's the opposite of democratic literacy, and that is the kind of thing that we're boiling in. And as soon as you start boiling in that, the appetite becomes we want fascism because we just want things to get done because the status quo doesn't work. But it's not that the status quo doesn't work, it's that it's been decompartmentalized, it's been institutionally corrupted, and it's been morally institutionally corrupted by essentially journalists foremost as well, but essentially by people that are holding this toxic line. But the judges, the Constitution did let in the devil, as it were, when they started playing with unconstitutional policy that was racialist policy, that was inconsistent with the Constitution, and then they invented this governmental prerogative, saying, oh, well, you can just have your toxic politics, it's fine. And the democracy can just sort this out. And that means that someone in some political party has to stand up and say, no, the Constitution has been gutted, it's been hollowed out, it's been betrayed, it failed to be defended, and essentially now the only way to defend it is through politics. That is what the judges have done. And we need to have an eye on that while we are criticizing the media. Because obviously now we have to criticize the media, because the media is running on a presupposition which is unprincipled, which is anti-constitutional. And so we have to say, no, you're actually betraying the Constitution. And someone has to do the political voice to that. And it's uncomfortable, and it's also unwieldy, because this is something that the judges should have removed from the political arena, but they didn't. So now someone has to say, well, the judges should have removed it, but they didn't, and so we have to try to do something in the interim. You have to make an argument like that, otherwise we're just going to boil in the illiberalism. We're going to play this game where, can people see through the gaslighting? Can people see through the normalization of racialist demagoguery and racialist populist politics? Can people see through it? I don't think they can unless we make the charge, unless we make the actual, the full-blown critique. I don't think it's possible. Anyway, this is the essence of my political advice.